Sometimes things don't break all at once. Sometimes they just stop working. And you don't notice right away because on the outside, everything looks the same. The same rituals, the same procedures, the same words being said. But right underneath, something really fundamental has changed. And then by the time you realize it, you can't remember exactly when it stopped being real. This is a story about what happens when one of the most important things in a democracy quietly stops functioning. Not because someone flipped a switch, but because, piece by piece, year by year, it just stopped meaning anything. Let's start with what elections are supposed to do. Think about how your school picks a class president. Everyone votes, you count the votes, whoever gets the most votes wins, and then the person who loses accepts it. They don't keep acting like they won, they don't try to stay in power anyway. That's the deal. That's what makes it work. Elections are how we change things without violence. They're how we agree to disagree and still live together afterward. You vote, someone wins, someone loses, and everyone accepts the result because the rules were fair. When elections work, the losing side gets to say, okay, we lost this time, but we'll try again in a few years. Maybe we'll win then. That hope, that possibility of change, is what makes people trust the system. But what happens when it stops being true? When you vote, and the same people stay in power no matter what? When the rules start feeling like decoration instead of something real? That's when things get a bit dangerous. In March 2013, a man named Hugo Chávez died. Chávez had been the president of Venezuela for 14 years. He was charismatic, popular, the kind of leader who could fill stadiums and make people believe he understood their problems. Love him or hate him, he was undeniably powerful. When he died, he left behind a movement, and he left behind his vice president, a man named Nicolás Maduro. Maduro had been a bus driver before he entered politics. He wasn't a general. He wasn't from a famous family. He was Chávez's loyal deputy, the guy who stood next to him during his tenure. And suddenly, he was president. In April 2013, Venezuela held a special election, which Maduro also ran. The opposition ran a candidate against him, and when the votes were counted, Maduro won by less than 2%, 1.6% to be exact. In a country where Chávez had won by massive margins, Maduro barely squeaked through. He had the title, but not the same support. And you could feel it. Something had obviously shifted. Over the next 5 years, Venezuela's economy collapsed. The country's wealth came from oil, so when oil prices were high, money flooded in. At the time, the government could afford to give people cheap food, healthcare, housing. But when oil prices fell in 2014, that system broke down. By 2016, inflation was out of control. Not normal inflation, where prices go up a little. Hyperinflation. The kind where your money just becomes worthless overnight. Where you would need a bag full of cash just to buy bread. Where the cash themselves weigh more than the bread they're supposed to buy. Supermarkets emptied. Hospitals ran out of medicine. People started leaving the country. And Maduro's response was to tighten his grip. In May 2018, Venezuela held another presidential election. But this time, something was different. Major opposition leaders were banned from running. Some were in jail. Some had fled the country. International observers said the election wasn't fair. And when the results came in, Maduro declared himself the winner. Half the country didn't even vote. They had already given up. They didn't believe it mattered anymore. That's the moment things really changed. Not because people were angry their side lost. That happens in democracies all the time. They were angry because the rules stopped feeling real. When you vote and nothing changes, the vote stops meaning anything. In 2017, people took to the streets. Months of protests. Students, mothers, elderly people. Hundreds of thousands marching in cities across Venezuela. They weren't protesting because of politics in the abstract sense. They were protesting because they were hungry, because their money was worthless, because they couldn't get medicine for sick family members. When voting didn't work, people tried protesting. The government's response was the usual force. Tear gas, rubber bullets, arrests in the middle of the night. Over 100 people died during those months. Opposition leaders were imprisoned, and news stations were shut down. The message was clear. Dissent would not be tolerated. By January 2019, something unprecedented happened.
The head of Venezuela's National Assembly, a man named Juan Guaido, declared himself interim president. He said Maduro's election had been illegitimate, and under the constitution, he was the rightful leader. A lot of countries agreed. The United States, most of Europe, most of Latin America. They recognized Guaido as Venezuela's president. But recognition doesn't mean power. Guaido had international support, but Maduro had control of the military. He also had the courts, and then the police. And so Venezuela had two presidents, one recognized by much of the world, and one actually in charge. Here's where you need to understand something about Venezuela's geography and economy. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world, more than Saudi Arabia, and even more than Russia. That oil made Venezuela one of the richest countries in South America for decades. But by 2019, that oil had become a problem.
The United States, under President Donald Trump, started imposing sanctions. These sanctions are economic penalties designed to cut off a country's access to money and trade. The U.S. stopped buying Venezuelan oil, froze Venezuelan assets in American banks, made it illegal for American companies to do business with Maduro's government. The goal here was to pressure Maduro to step down, to make staying in power so expensive and difficult that he'd give up. But it didn't work that way. Instead, Maduro found new friends, countries that didn't care about democracy or human rights. Russia sent military advisors and loans. China sent billions of dollars in exchange for future oil. Iran sent fuel shipments when Venezuela's own refineries stopped working. Maduro didn't need or care about everyone liking him. He just needed enough powerful friends to keep the lights on for him. And for this, the Venezuelan people paid the price. The sanctions made everything worse. Food became even scarcer. Medicine is even harder to find. By 2021, over 5 million Venezuelans had left the country, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere in modern history. If this breakdown is making you think differently about how governments actually work, you'll probably want to hit that subscribe button and turn post notifications before you forget. Now, back to the video. Between 2020 and 2023, something strange happened. The international community kept condemning Maduro. The United Nations called his government illegitimate. The Organization of American States expelled Venezuela. News articles called him a dictator, but he remained in power. Because here's what nobody really makes clear about authoritarian governments. They don't need to be popular. They just need to control the right things, like the military, the courts, the police, and ultimately the flow of information. Maduro learned this. State television became pure propaganda. Independent newspapers were shut down. When protests happened, the internet speed was manipulated so people couldn't organize or share videos. And slowly, quietly, people started giving up. Not all of them, but enough. When you protest and nothing changes. When you vote and nothing changes. When your country is recognized by no one but the people who matter, the ones with guns, still obey the government. At that point, you stop trying. In July 2024, Venezuela held another election. The opposition had unified behind a single candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez. This time, polls suggested something remarkable, a massive lead, the kind of margin that would be impossible to deny. When the votes were counted on July 28th, the government announced that Maduro had won. Again, no detailed breakdown, no precinct-by-precinct numbers, just an announcement. The opposition published their own count. They had witnesses at polling stations. They had receipts from voting machines. And by their tally, Gonzalez had won by over 30 percentage points. Nobody believed the official results. Other countries, international observers, and even the Venezuelan people themselves. But that didn't matter to Maduro. The usual election ritual was performed, but the choice didn't exist. That's what it looks like when elections stop meaning anything. They don't disappear, they just become decoration. Something that happens because it's supposed to happen, not because it matters. In August 2024, the United States did something unusual. They designated a group called the Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist organization, and they named Maduro as its leader. The accusation was that Venezuela wasn't just an authoritarian government, it was a criminal enterprise. That Maduro's regime was trafficking drugs, laundering money,
running the country like organized crime. The bounty on Maduro went from $15 million to a whopping $50 million, the largest ever placed on a foreign head of state. While this was done, an aircraft carrier group had already moved into the Caribbean Sea. For months, nothing happened publicly. But behind the scenes, the CIA was tracking Maduro's movements, where he slept, where he traveled, building a profile. Elite U.S. military units were training on a replica of Maduro's compound, the same way they'd practiced for the raid that captured Osama bin Laden, going through the breach procedure over and over until they could do it in complete darkness. In late November 2025, President Trump called Maduro directly and told him to surrender now or face the consequences. Maduro considered it. According to Trump, he came close to agreeing, but he wanted guarantees, which was legal immunity, a delayed departure, and control of the military even after stepping down. All three requests were denied. So, Maduro decided not to surrender. January 3rd, 2026, 2 in the morning in Caracas. The lights went out across the capital. U.S. forces had cut the power grid. People heard helicopters flying low over the city. Some residents took out their devices and started filming. You can see the footage now. Shaky videos of lights cutting through darkness, the sound of rotors and tracers streaking across the sky. U.S. Special Forces were hitting air defense systems with the intentions of clearing a path. The main assault team breached Fort Tiuna, the largest military base in Caracas, where Maduro was staying. There was gunfire and explosions. One U.S. helicopter was damaged, and several soldiers got injured. But by 3:30 in the morning, it was over. Maduro and his wife were captured. By dawn, they were on an aircraft carrier bound for New York. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, and parts of Caracas were still dark.
At 4:17 in the morning, President Trump posted that the operation had been a successful one and that Maduro had been captured and removed from the country. Some Venezuelans celebrated. Videos show people crying with relief. Families separated by years and borders started calling each other. But not everyone celebrated. Some neighborhoods stayed quiet. Government supporters protested, demanding Maduro's release. The vice president went on television, claiming to still be in charge. Millions of Venezuelans just watched, confused and uncertain about what any of all this meant, while Maduro is currently being tried in court where he pleads not guilty. Anyway, this story isn't really about him. It's about what happens when the basic machinery of democracy stops working, when elections become rituals instead of choices, when people lose faith that their vote matters. This didn't start with soldiers or helicopters or a dramatic capture. It started years earlier, in 2013, in 2018, in 2019, when Venezuelans realized that voting no longer changed anything. It started when the rules stopped being real. That's the lesson here. Democracies don't collapse overnight. They erode, one election at a time, one stolen result at a time, one moment where people just be like, what's the point? This happens until enough people stop believing, and then the whole thing just stops functioning. Most people watching this unfold from other countries thought it was about one bad leader or about removing a dictator, but it was really about something much simpler and disastrous, about what happens when people stop trusting that their choices matter, and how hard it is to rebuild that trust once it's gone. The last time something like this happened, with U.S. forces capturing a foreign head of state, was Panama in 1989, 37 years ago. Nobody knows if what comes next will be better, or if Venezuela will hold real elections now. Nobody knows if the millions who fled will come home, if the institutions that is currently broken can be fixed. That's the uncertainty everyone is living with right now. But one thing is clear. This story didn't end with Maduro's capture. How it will end, I don't know. But if you stay tuned, we will definitely find out. See you in the next one.